He lost his job, and his wife kicked him out the same night, locking arms with his best friend. But she didn't know James had a secret weapon: the law. What happened next turned her smug little dream life into a waking nightmare. What would you do if your spouse betrayed you with your best friend? James Carter wasn't supposed to be home that early, but traffic in Dallas had been lighter than usual, and he figured getting back before sunset would be a nice surprise for his wife, Rebecca. He loosened his tie as he stepped through the door, quiet and unnoticed. From the living room came a burst of laughter, Rebecca's voice, unmistakably loud, followed by the clink of a wineglass. He froze in place, the kind of stillness that isn't about fear, but clarity. "I swear," her voice curled through the air, laced with sarcasm, "if it weren't for that paycheck, I'd have left him already." James didn't move. He didn't speak. He listened. "Daniel is everything James isn't," Rebecca continued, unaware her words were cutting straight through the man standing just feet away. "Confident, exciting, alive. My husband, he's just beige, safe, and not in a good way." There was a muffled chuckle. A man's. Daniel. James's best friend. "I don't even know what I'm still doing here," she added, lowering her voice, but not enough. "Daniel makes me feel like I matter. Like a woman." James closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Then he opened them again and stepped backward as silently as he came in. His briefcase weighed heavy in his hand, but not because of what was inside. The words he just heard had turned it into a brick. He didn't make a scene. No confrontation, no yelling, no shattering glass or broken vows hurled across the room. Just silence, and then the front door closing behind him. In the driver's seat of his car, James sat in the fading light, staring through the windshield at nothing. The laughter from the house still rang in his ears, but it didn't shake him. It focused him. Rebecca thought she was trading up, that Daniel was a step forward, that James, without his job, was disposable. But she didn't know who she was really married to, and that mistake would cost her everything. The next few days played out like nothing had changed. James came home at the usual hour. Rebecca greeted him with a practiced smile, kissed his cheek, and poured wine into his glass like any other night. She talked about neighborhood gossip, mentioned dinner plans with friends, and smiled as if nothing had happened. And James played along. Perfectly. He asked polite questions, laughed at the right moments, cleared the plates and washed the dishes after dinner, just like he always did. But under the surface, he was taking notes, measuring every lie, every flicker of deceit behind her eyes. Not to fight, but to build a case. The next evening, he came home with an envelope in hand. Rebecca opened it without hesitation. Her eyes scanned the page and her smile didn't even falter as she set it down. "Fired?" she asked, tone flat but indifferent. James nodded. "Budget cuts." Rebecca didn't pretend to be sympathetic. Not really. She cooked his favorite meal that night, poured expensive wine, lit candles. But it wasn't kindness, it was control. She was securing her next move. James watched her with the same calm he had in the car that first night. He smiled when she smiled, kissed her when she leaned in, played the part of the failed man grateful to have a supportive wife. But every morning he left the house dressed for work, briefcase in hand. Rebecca thought he was out job hunting. In reality, he was building a legal fortress. Coffee shops, law libraries, private meetings. His real job had just begun. By the end of the third week, the tension in the house was thick. Rebecca's patience had worn thin. She began staying out late, making up excuses, claiming dinners with friends, emergency errands, sudden errands at odd hours. James said nothing. He just kept observing. Then on a Monday morning, it happened. 2 suitcases sat by the door when he came home. His. Rebecca stood in the doorway with divorce papers in hand and Daniel behind her, arm wrapped around her waist. "You're not the man I need anymore," she said. "This house is mine now. Just sign." James looked at her, then at Daniel, and then back at the woman he once built a life with. He signed, and then he left. But he wasn't broken. He wasn't defeated. He wasn't even surprised, because while they had been playing checkers, James had already started his game of chess. The night James left, he didn't go to a motel. He didn't crash on a friend's couch or wander into a bar. He drove 45 minutes north to a private estate tucked behind iron gates and a mile of tree-lined drive, a place no one, including Rebecca, knew existed. It had belonged to his father, and now it was his. He unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and placed the two suitcases down without a word. He poured himself a drink and sat in the study, phone in hand. One call, that's all it took. "Richard," he said when the voice picked up, "Northwood Estate, Monday morning. We're filing." On Monday, the plan began. Richard was more than a lawyer. He was the kind of man you called when you wanted someone's legal foundation stripped to the studs. And James had built enough of a war chest over the years to do just that. The documents were prepared in silence. Rebecca had served him papers, claimed ownership of the house, and declared herself the winner. But she had no idea that the house had never been in his name. The Northwood Trust had owned it since before they were married. Ironclad, untouchable. And now, with her fraudulent claim on trust property, James had every legal right to strike back. But that wasn't all. Daniel, the best friend turned lover, had no idea who James really was. He thought James was just another mid-level executive. What he didn't know, James was the actual owner of the firm. Not on paper, not for appearances, but in substance. He controlled the board through proxies, owned the shares through layered trusts, and signed off on every major hire, including Daniel's. That would be important. James moved quietly. He didn't rant on social media. He didn't call friends to vent. He let them laugh, let them post their vacation pictures, their celebratory dinners, their smug selfies. He let them believe they had pulled off the perfect betrayal. Then on a Friday morning, Rebecca answered the door to a courier. It was just an envelope. She signed for it casually, thinking it was a routine legal follow-up from the divorce filing. She opened it on her way back through the foyer. Her eyes scanned the first few lines and froze. The paper slipped from her fingers. Words like fraudulent claim, damages, and seizure of property stared back at her in black ink. The lawsuit was real. The signature at the bottom belonged to a firm that didn't lose cases. She barely made it to the couch before her legs gave out. Upstairs, Daniel was getting dressed for work when he heard her scream. He came running down, shirt half-buttoned, and snatched the papers from her shaking hands. The more he read, the more his expression fell apart. At the bottom, filed on behalf of the Northwood Trust by James Carter, trustee and beneficiary. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came. Down at the office, a separate letter was making its way through the HR department. Daniel received it just before 10 a.m. A manager met him outside his cubicle with a neutral expression and a sealed envelope. Inside, immediate termination, misconduct, breach of ethics, his access revoked, security waiting to escort him out. He protested, of course, but it was no use. The system was already in motion. Within days, the whispers began. First among co-workers, then on social media, then in their social circle. Rumors turned to questions. Questions turned into sideways glances. Rebecca's glow dimmed and Daniel's phone stopped ringing. Then came the court summons. James had filed for a formal hearing. Rebecca was being sued for damages stemming from the attempted seizure of a trust-owned property. She wasn't just being evicted. She was facing full legal exposure. And James? He didn't say a word publicly. Not one interview. Not one post. He didn't celebrate or gloat. He simply kept moving. 3 days before the hearing, his attorney submitted a request for full financial disclosure from both defendants, Rebecca and Daniel. Credit history, employment, income, everything. Rebecca's lawyer tried to stall. James's response? A single sentence. Let the truth speak. By now, Rebecca was no longer sure who she had married. The man she'd laughed at, dismissed, betrayed, wasn't just some salaryman. He was the architect of her downfall, and he had done it without ever raising his voice. As the trial date approached, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters waited. Neighbors whispered. Even strangers had started following the story online. But James wasn't there to make a scene. He wasn't after revenge for the sake of drama. He was there to prove a point. That betrayal doesn't go unnoticed, and that consequences have a schedule. That schedule was about to begin. The courthouse was packed. On the morning of the hearing, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters, spectators, former colleagues, and more than a few neighbors who had watched Rebecca's perfect life unravel. Everyone knew why they were there. The betrayal, the lawsuit, the silent man who had become an online legend without saying a word. James arrived without security or entourage. No briefcase, no drama, just calm. Rebecca and Daniel were already seated at the defense table, their hands clenched under the desk. Her face was tight, his eyes down. They had dressed for control, but their nerves betrayed them. The judge called the courtroom to order. The bailiff announced the case, Northwood Trust versus Rebecca Langford et al. The room settled into silence. Richard, James's attorney, stood. His voice was crisp. Your Honor, we are here because the defendant attempted to seize property that was never legally hers. This property, the residence in question, has been part of the Northwood Trust since before the marriage began. Mrs. Langford filed a false claim, knowingly, in an attempt to gain ownership of assets not subject to marital division. Rebecca's lawyer stood next. He painted a different picture. A woman who had no idea her husband was wealthy, a woman who thought she was living in a shared marital home, a woman deceived. The judge listened without comment, his expression unreadable. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Carter, take the stand. James rose, walked to the witness box, and placed his hand on the Bible. His voice was steady. I do. Richard began the questioning. Mr. Carter, can you clarify your relationship to the Northwood Trust? I am both the trustee and the beneficiary, James answered. The trust owns multiple properties, including the home currently under dispute. It was never purchased through marital income. It was never co-owned. And why was this not public knowledge? James looked directly at the courtroom. Because transparency with the wrong people can become a liability. I needed to know who saw me and who saw my wallet. There was a stir in the gallery. Did your wife know about the trust? Richard asked. No, not until she filed to take what never belonged to her. The opposing attorney rose for cross-examination. He was confident until he opened his mouth. Mr. Carter, isn't it true that by hiding your wealth, you created a false reality for your wife? I created a normal life, James said. I gave her loyalty, stability, a home. What she did with that revealed her truth, not mine. And yet you admit you misled her? I gave her every chance to be honest. She failed. The lawyer paused, clearly caught off guard, then quietly sat down. The judge looked over his notes and nodded. Mrs. Langford, take the stand. Rebecca walked to the front. Her voice was softer than before, still trying to control the narrative. Mrs. Langford, did you believe the house was marital property? Her attorney asked. Yes, she replied. I thought we built that life together. And when your husband lost his job? Her voice cracked slightly. I was scared. I didn't know what would happen. I made a mistake. Richard stood for cross. Mrs. Langford, is it true you were in a romantic relationship with Mr. Harlow while still married? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes or no? Yes. And did you tell your husband you wanted a divorce before or after discovering he had lost his job? After, she said, barely audible. And did you serve those papers while holding another man's hand? Rebecca blinked rapidly but said nothing. Richard turned to the judge. No further questions. Daniel never took the stand. He sat silent, eyes fixed on the floor. The judge leaned back. The court finds that the property in question belongs entirely to the Northwood Trust. All claims made by the defendant are denied. Mrs. Langford is liable for damages, legal costs, and restitution of any funds or property acquired under false claims. Rebecca's gasp filled the room. She clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. Daniel didn't move. The gavel struck once. It was over. James stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out as quietly as he had entered. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't look back. The courtroom buzzed in his wake. Online, people were already calling it the most elegant takedown of the year. But James didn't care about public reaction. His victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about closure. He had trusted Rebecca, loved her, gave her a life with no strings. But she tied her own noose, and Daniel, He had made his choice too. Neither of them knew that the quiet man they'd underestimated had built his entire life on patience and legal precision. James didn't need revenge. He just needed the truth to be seen. And now, it had been. The aftermath was brutal and silent. Rebecca returned to the house she thought she owned only to find it empty, legally transferred back to the Northwood Trust within hours of the ruling. A property manager was waiting at the door with two options: remove her belongings within 48 hours or face legal eviction. No appeals, no delays. Daniel tried to step in to argue, but his name wasn't on anything. Not the deed, not the trust, not the marriage. He was just a guest, now unwelcome. They packed in silence. The same bags Rebecca once made James carry now held her own life in pieces. Friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. She checked her phone constantly, hoping for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But there was nothing. Daniel, meanwhile, was jobless and disgraced. His termination had reached every corner of the industry within days. Word got around fast. The email James's legal team had sent, detailing Daniel's violation of company policy, had made it clear. No one wanted to hire a liability with a public scandal attached to his name. He applied everywhere. Got nothing. The savings they'd assumed would carry them disappeared into court-ordered payments. Rebecca was hit with damages, legal fees, and restitution totaling more than she could afford. She tried to sell jewelry, furniture, anything that hadn't already been acquired through James's income. But once the financial discovery process was complete, most of it was seized or counted as repayment. In public, Rebecca tried to keep her head high, but the whispers followed her. She lost everything because she chased status. She thought she married a nobody. Turns out, he owned the whole board. At restaurants, people stared. At the gym, conversations stopped when she entered. The world that once adored her was now a closed door. One evening, Daniel suggested they leave the city. Start over. Maybe somewhere quieter. Rebecca said nothing. She knew what that meant. He wasn't suggesting a fresh start. He was looking for a way out. He left 2 days later, packed a single duffel, left a note, and disappeared. Rebecca tried to call. He didn't answer. Now alone, Rebecca returned to her parents' house, the same place she swore she'd never go back to. Her mother greeted her at the door with a look that held no sympathy, only disappointment. In the months that followed, James kept living his life, quietly. He resumed work behind the scenes of his company, continued his role managing the trust, and rebuilt in peace. People who once called him boring or too quiet now saw him in a different light. He wasn't the kind of man who needed attention. He was the kind who let outcomes speak. When people asked him what happened, he simply said, "We had different definitions of loyalty. No headlines, no exposés. Just the steady rise of a man who never needed to shout to be heard." The irony didn't escape anyone. Rebecca had traded her marriage for a man who couldn't protect her from anything. James had walked away and left her standing in the ruins she created. She'd thought he was just an ordinary man. She never thought he was the one writing the rules. The final chapter wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. 3 months after the trial, James Carter walked into his office through the private elevator, just as he always had. There were no press conferences, no interviews, no public celebrations. Just a quiet return to routine. A routine he had never truly abandoned, only stepped back from to correct a personal mistake. Rebecca and Daniel had both disappeared from the city's radar. She lived in a smaller town now, working at a local boutique. Her days were long, her pay low. People recognized her sometimes, mostly from online articles, sometimes from courthouse photos, but no one ever said anything to her face. She was living under the shadow of her own choices. Daniel had changed his last name and relocated twice, trying to shake the online stigma, but the internet doesn't forget. His resume never survived the second interview. He blamed everyone but himself. In private forums, he occasionally posted vague rants about betrayal and rich people playing games, but no one responded. James never spoke of them again. He didn't need to. He'd made his point without ever losing control. He hadn't shouted, threatened, or humiliated them. He let the truth do the work, and the system deliver the results. In a world where people chase quick wins and loud victories, James had played a long game, one built on facts, patience, and discipline. He spent more time at the Northwood estate now. It had always been his escape. Now it was his home. He invited friends over, real ones, people who knew him for who he was, not what he owned. One afternoon over coffee with a colleague, someone finally asked, "Why didn't you just expose her online?" "You had every right," James answered without hesitation. "Because I didn't need sympathy. I needed peace. And peace doesn't come from proving them wrong. It comes from proving myself right." The message was clear. Betrayal doesn't justify destruction. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about clarity, about setting things right without sinking to the level of those who wronged you. The story of James Carter became a quiet lesson in circles that mattered. Not because it ended in drama, but because it didn't. Because he let the consequences speak louder than anger ever could. He didn't need to fight to win. He just needed to stay standing while others fell on their own. So when people asked, did she get what she deserved? The answer was simple. Yes. And when they asked, would you have forgiven her? James never answered. Some questions don't need a reply. They just need time and truth.